Earlier in the meeting, Bethany asked, are you going to cook dinner or have a takeaway? I've now got the next question. Bethany and I didn't talk about this, but here it comes. How do you decide which takeaway to have? In your family, who makes the decision and what's the basis of your decision? There are different types of decision makers, aren't there? They're the decisive ones. You know who you are. You know your own mind. You know what you like and what you don't like. And once you've made up your mind, nobody's shifting you. I'm not going to ask you to put your hands up. There are the deliberate ones, a little bit more cautious, probably like to work out all the options. When did we last have Chinese or Indian or pizza or fish and chips or Thai or whatever? Somebody thought of one, I didn't, but there we go. What does everyone prefer? Is there something that everyone will eat? So it's a much more deliberate and cautious decision. And then there's the ditherers. They take ages to make a decision and they keep changing their mind because every time someone suggests something else, it sounds better than what they'd really chosen, so they'd like to change. And so you get this constant, well, I don't really know. One of our daughters said, well, in our family, we all just say, well, I don't mind until one of us makes a decision, and I'll leave you to guess which one that is. But sometimes there's a lot more than a family meal at stake. The story we read a few minutes ago took place just before Jesus was arrested, and there had been some significant moments in the conversation just before they went to the Garden of Olives. Jesus had told the disciples that he wanted to share that meal with them before he suffered. There doesn't appear to be any doubt that he knew what was coming in the next few days. He'd reinterpreted the bread and wine of the Passover, and he'd spoken of betrayal. He'd refereed in a dispute about which disciple was the greatest and taken the opportunity to teach them a new perspective on greatness. And he'd had a special word with Simon Peter about temptation and denial. Luke's account of the story mentions Satan in that little bit about Satan sifting Peter. And maybe here's an indication that Jesus knew that the forces of evil were already active. And in fact, although the disciples didn't know it, Judas had already left to meet the high priest. And so they go out. And they cross the Kidron Valley. They go over the stream at the bottom of the valley, the brook Kidron. And then they went to the Mount of Olives. Now, I have to say, this is not much of a mountain. It's 140 feet higher than the rest of Jerusalem. Now, Jerusalem itself is on a hill, but even so, it's not much of a mountain. But there was a garden there, called the Garden of Gethsemane in the other Gospels, and there Jesus prayed. Selena Stone, drawing on her Pentecostal Caribbean heritage, talks about this space as a space in which they tarried with God. It's not a word you hear very often now, but it carries in that tradition a sense of waiting with God and for God. It's the in-between space between all they'd hoped for and what was almost inevitable. This was a liminal space for Jesus and the disciples. You see, the fact is that Jesus had seriously annoyed some very powerful Jewish leaders, and he knew it was all going to come to a head very soon. This prayer in the garden marked the watershed moment in the life of Jesus. And the outcome would literally determine the course of history. That night, the salvation of the world was at stake as Jesus prayed. This was the pivotal moment that led to the crucifixion and resurrection. Jesus had been warning the disciples of betrayal and death. They hadn't listened very well, but he had been. And now the moment had come. And only if Jesus died would God's plan of redemption be revealed. And the stage would be set for God's kingdom to be established in a new way. Jesus, the man, must face his future. And if we truly believe that Jesus was human as well as divine, then we have to believe that this was a real choice and a freely chosen decision. He could, even at this point, have walked away, disappeared into the hills behind the Mount of Olives, and saved his own life. So no wonder the Bible records that he was in anguish. He prayed, "Father, if you are willing, take this cup from me." One wonders if in that moment he thought of another mountain, of Mount Moriah, and how God had provided a lamb so that Abraham would not have to sacrifice his son Isaac. Would God do this again for his own son? Was there a different way? But it was not to be. This time, the sacrifice would happen. And the son who died would become known as the Lamb of God, who takes away the sin of the world. We've got a picture, I think, of the bound lamb. It's a strange painting, in a sense, by the painter Zurbarán, but it just indicates the helplessness of a lamb who is bound and is to be sacrificed. And much later, the writer of the book of Revelation would record a vision of the end times and a lamb that looked as if it had been slain in front of the throne of God. And the lamb was receiving the praises of numberless crowds of people who were wearing white robes. Revelation identifies them as people who had faced trial and temptation and had been saved by the blood of the lamb. And that same lamb, the risen Jesus, would now be their shepherd and their sustainer. Revelation 7:13 says, "For the lamb at the center of the throne will be their shepherd. He will lead them to springs of living water, and God will wipe away every tear from their eyes." The imagery is difficult and sometimes, quite honestly, in Revelation, confusing. But it draws a direct line from Jesus' choice in the garden through the crucifixion and the resurrection to the time when God will ultimately make things right. But back to the Garden of Gethsemane. If the first part of Jesus' prayer was hopeful, the second part was decisive. "Yet not my will, but yours be done." David Lyle Jeffrey says simply, "These are amongst the most important words in the New Testament, and indeed all of Christian theology." It was the moment when Jesus chose the will of God and not his own. He knew that his God-given vocation was to be arrested, tried, and killed, and to face the darkness of separation from his Father. And he still chose God's way, even if he longed that God's will might be different. John Nolan says what stands as finally fundamental for Jesus is the will of God, his Father. Ultimately, that was what mattered. And from this point, it was only moments to Jesus' arrest and all that would follow. And what of the disciples in all this? The truth is, they were probably scared out of their minds at this point. When rebel leaders were arrested and crucified, their followers were often rounded up and followed the same fate. So if Jesus was arrested as a rebel leader, which is how he was viewed, they would probably come looking for the disciples too. And in all of this, the disciples really still hadn't understood what kind of a kingdom Jesus was establishing. And it just seemed that everything was coming crashing down. Last week, Ellie mentioned in the sermon about the first mission of the disciples, and to go with no bags, no bread, nothing extra to take with them. This evening, Jesus has said to them, take everything. Take money, take bag, even take a weapon if you've got one. You go prepared now for what may happen. In Matthew and Mark, Jesus asked the inner group of the disciples to watch with him while he prayed. But in Luke's gospel, they are instructed to pray for themselves, that they don't fall into temptation. You see, however they felt that evening, however scared they were, however confused they were about what seemed to be the end of Jesus' ministry, they were needed to carry the mission forward. Jesus knew they would be tested and they would suffer. And it wasn't to be immediately, but it would come for many of them. They needed to be prepared to be faithful in the hard times. Very quickly, Peter would be tested in the courtyard of the high priest and would fail spectacularly, but not finally, as he would later discover, as can we, that beyond failure there is forgiveness and fruitfulness. So maybe this is where we find ourselves in this story, as followers who need to learn to be obedient, to set aside our own choices and ambitions, and to learn to say, not my will, my way, but your way, God, and your will. This prayer of submission was central to Jesus' relationship with his Father. And a similar prayer will be central to our relationship with God. But it's also probably the most fundamental struggle for us as human beings, because actually we like choosing our own way. We like making up our own minds about what's going to happen. Well, at least I do. Perhaps one reason that we struggle with this is because in the 21st century, the word submission carries overtones of oppression and loss and negation of ourselves. But it isn't actually like that as it was in the Bible. Writing 70 years ago in the 1950s, a scholar called William Barclay says, actually, it just makes a difference what tone of voice we hear it in our heads, and what tone of voice we say it with for ourselves when we say, your will be done. It can be helpless submission, resignation, when we've lost hope because we can't fight what we're facing, so, we may as well give in. It might be an even stronger capitulation, a complete defeat. We have already lost the battle, so there's no other option. It might be in a tone of frustration coupled with regret and anger as our dreams fade and die. Or it could be, says Barclay, perfect trust, Your will be done, Lord. Submitting to a love that will not let us go, even if we don't understand what is going to happen. Giving our life back to God for him to use. It's learning to respond to the words of Jesus to take up our own cross and follow as God leads. But as human beings, many of us don't find it very easy to admit that God always works for our good, or to accept that our submission to God will not negate fulfillment in life or take away the things that bring us joy. You know, I'd love to know who started the rumor that if we're obedient to God, we will in some way lose out on life and probably become very dour and very miserable. I don't know where it came from, but generations of Christians have proved it's not true. But sometimes I think all of us may need reminding that when we say to God, your will and your way, he doesn't take away everything. He gives us more. Quite a long time ago, when our children were younger, there was a Children's Fun Day, I think it was called, in a leisure centre in Cambridge. And we took the kids from our corps to it, and there were very strict instructions. You go to the park and ride, you leave your cars there, and there will be chartered double-decker buses to take all these children to the leisure centre. And so we did as we were told and drove into the centre of Cambridge on this double-decker bus. We were on the top deck and we were surrounded by large numbers of small children who were looking forward to a really fun day. So it was quiet. Not. And as I looked out of the window, I looked over Parker's Piece, one of the big greens in Cambridge, and I saw a lot of students sort of going in all directions on bikes with rucksacks. And I had a sort of moment of, oh, that's all gone, which actually was a bit ironic because when I did my degree, I'd lived at home and I had never in the whole of my life up to that point owned a bike. So I'm not sure what it was all about. And the moment passed and we had the fun day, got back to our cars and went home. It was probably only about 6 months later that we were appointed to Cambridge. And very shortly after that, we discovered the only way around that city, if you didn't want to spend most of your life in a traffic jam, was on a bike. And so I owned my very first bike. And within a few months of that, I had discovered that there was an MA course in the city part-time at the Theological Federation, and I could be part of it. And one day, cycling across the green, I remembered the moment on the bus, and it almost felt like God was laughing at me, saying, see, you thought you'd given it all up and you haven't, because here you are. And I never knew until I started it that I wanted to do an MA, but that's a whole different story. God gave it all back, even though I didn't know I was missing it, to be perfectly honest. And it has led to more through the last 20 odd years, a lot more privileges, challenges. I was just reminded that when I think I've given things up, God may have other plans. You see, we find that in choosing God's will, we can flourish in ways we've never imagined. But like Jesus, we have the free choice to make, our way or God's way. And sometimes that causes a bit of anguish. But the decision we make will shape our lives. And if we choose God, from that decision, eventually will flow a posture of living as God wants us to live, a daily habit of wanting to live for God and with God. And it doesn't matter what kind of a decision maker we are, whether we're decisive, dithering, or deliberate, or anything else. What matters is that ultimately we choose to say, not my will, but yours, Lord, and make it a final decision. We won't face what Jesus faced, and it's unlikely we'll face what the disciples faced. But we all have our own challenges and difficult times, and our own temptations. And for most of us, if not all of us, there are many times when we prefer to choose what we think is best. So the decision is always a live one. It's never finally fixed. It needs to be revisited, reaffirmed. Not what I want, but what you want, God. Selina Stone comments, as we place our hands in the lives in the hands of God, we trust God to sift it all and to give us back the treasures that are of eternal value. God will take everything we offer, but he'll give us back treasures in our lives. Unlike Jesus, our yes to God may not change the course of history in a dramatic way, but it does change our history and our life. And as we live, worship, and work with each other, the ripples of our choices will make a difference to us personally, in this church, and in our society. We're going to spend a few moments now in reflection. There's some questions that are going to come on the screen, and you may want to choose one of them just to think about as Ira plays for us. Are you willing to say to God, I choose your way for my life? You might think that's something that you have long since settled. And so then I would say, well, what have you gained from choosing God's will? And one that reflects our prayers earlier. How can we as a community support and help each other to choose God's way? And what difference will it make in the world when we do? In a few moments, Ira will she will play, then she will lead automatically into the song of sacrament. The familiar words from Albert Osborne and Matt Spencer blend together and have many echoes of this story. My all is in the Master's hands for him to bless and break. Beyond the brook, his winepress stands, and thence my way I take, resolve the whole of love's demands to give for his dear sake. Jesus crossed the brook, the little stream in the Kidron Valley, and went to make a decision. And in this song, we are saying we're prepared to do that too. Later on in the song, it will talk about complete surrender, my life abandoned to your will. Lord, I would faithful be. Reflect on the questions, then as we sing the song, think about how that song applies to your life. Thank you, Ira.